At 5:23 on the morning of March 8, 1945, Corporal Daniel Walsh crouched at the edge of a hedgerow outside Remagen, Germany, dragging a 40-foot length of clothesline rope across the ground ahead of him while his platoon sergeant called him the laundryman. 24 years old, Pennsylvania coal miner's son, zero explosives training. The Germans had mined the approach to the Ludendorff Bridge with tripwires that had killed 11 men from the 9th Armored Division in the past 36 hours. Walsh's company commander had told him to leave the rope in his pack and move like a soldier. The other squad leaders called it his housewife's hobby. When he'd started using the rope drag technique during training at Camp Polk, Louisiana, the demolitions instructor wanted to know if Walsh was planning to hang laundry or clear mines. Walsh explained it was for tripwires. They deployed before he could test it in the field. Walsh spent the Atlantic crossing coiling and uncoiling that rope while other men played poker and cleaned weapons. His equipment looked standard issue: M1 Garand, combat pack, entrenching tool, steel helmet, same gear carried by every other infantryman in his battalion. Except for one detail. Wrapped around his pack frame, secured with canvas straps, was 40 feet of white clothesline rope with knots tied every 18 inches. The rope drag had no technical manual, no official designation, no approval from ordnance specialists. Just rope configured in a specific pattern that, when dragged properly across suspected ground, would catch on tripwires before a man's boot could trigger them. It was brilliant in its simplicity, and everyone who saw Walsh use it thought he'd lost his mind. Captain Hendricks had ordered Walsh to ditch the rope during pre-deployment inspection at Camp Polk. Unauthorized equipment, violation of standard operating procedure. Walsh had ditched it, then retrieved it from the trash bin 2 hours later and repacked it. Master Sergeant Coleman had been more direct. "Walsh, you look like a goddamn milkman dragging that thing around. You planning to trip over Germans or just confuse them into surrendering?" Walsh had tried explaining the mechanics. A rope dragged at shin height across terrain would catch on wire strung between stakes or vegetation. The knots created friction points that amplified the catch. When the rope snagged, the soldier stopped, examined the ground, located the tripwire before stepping on whatever it was connected to. Coleman had listened for about 20 seconds before cutting him off. "I don't care about your clothesline magic tricks, Walsh. I care about you moving fast when we hit France. That rope nonsense gets packed away before we land, or I'll use it to string you up by your ankles." Walsh had nodded, said yes, Sergeant, kept the rope in his pack. The 9th Armored Division had landed at Utah Beach on September 23, 1944, D-Day plus 108. The invasion was over, the breakout was over, now came the grinding push toward Germany. Walsh had waded through shallow water carrying his Garand and his pack with the rope coiled inside. No enemy fire, no casualties, just mud and exhaustion and the long walk inland.
The rope stayed in his pack through France, Normandy countryside, the siege of Metz, the winter fighting in the Ardennes. Walsh carried it for 5 months without using it, not because he didn't believe in it, because nobody would let him. He'd suggested using the rope drag during patrol operations in November. Coleman had said no, too slow, too visible, too stupid. He'd suggested it again in December when the division was clearing German defensive positions near the Belgian border. Hendricks had said no. Standard mine detection procedures were adequate. Walsh stopped suggesting it, just carried the rope and waited for the moment when standard procedures would fail, and someone would finally let him try something different. That moment came on March 7, 1945, at the Ludendorff Bridge in Remagen. The 9th Armored had been pushing toward the Rhine River. Every bridge across the Rhine had been destroyed by retreating German forces. Every bridge except one. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was still standing when American forces arrived. Damaged, but standing. The Germans had tried to demolish it. The charges had failed. The bridge was intact and the Rhine was crossable. Taking that bridge would change the war. Crossing the Rhine meant American forces could bypass Germany's prepared defensive lines, could strike directly into the industrial heartland, could end the war months earlier than projected. But the Germans knew this too. They'd mined the approaches to the bridge with everything they had. Teller mines buried in the roads, S-mines, bouncing betties hidden in the vegetation, and tripwires. Hundreds of tripwires connected to grenades, mortars, demolition charges, anything that would kill American soldiers trying to reach the bridge. The 9th Armored's initial assault on March 7th had been successful, but costly. They'd taken the bridge, secured the far side, established a bridgehead. But 11 men had died from tripwire-activated explosives while advancing through the approaches. Another 19 had been wounded. The tripwires were nearly invisible. Thin steel wire painted dark green or brown, strung 4 to 8 inches above ground level, attached to stakes driven into earth or tied to vegetation. When a boot or vehicle hit the wire, it pulled a pin or released a striker that detonated the attached explosive. Standard mine detection involved engineers using metal detectors and prodding tools. Slow work, methodical work. But metal detectors couldn't find tripwires. The wire was too thin, the signal was too weak, and prodding the ground with a bayonet didn't help when the tripwire was strung above the surface. Engineers had been clearing the approach roads for 2 days, making progress. But the fields and vegetation on either side of the roads remained uncleared. And the Germans were using those fields to launch counterattacks, infiltrating at night, setting up machine gun positions, firing on American forces holding the bridge. Walsh's company was tasked with clearing German positions from the fields south of the bridge. Standard infantry assault. 2 platoons advancing in line, covering fire from the company's machine gun section. Artillery support if needed. Captain Hendricks briefed the operation on the evening of March 7th. Told them the attack would begin at dawn. Move fast, stay low. Suppress enemy positions and hold the ground. Standard tactics for standard warfare. Everyone in that briefing knew it wasn't standard. The fields were mined. The approaches were trapped. Moving fast meant stepping on tripwires. Staying low meant not seeing the wires until it was too late. Walsh had sat through the briefing without speaking. Afterwards, he had approached Master Sergeant Coleman privately. "Sergeant, request permission to use rope drag detection on point during the assault." Coleman had looked at him like he'd suggested they surrendered to the Germans. "Walsh, we're assaulting at dawn. Speed matters. You can't clear tripwires fast enough with a goddamn clothesline." "I can if you give me a clear lane, just 20 yards wide, enough for the platoon to advance behind me." Coleman had studied him for a long moment, then glanced at Walsh's pack, at the rope still coiled and strapped to the frame. "You've been carrying that thing since Louisiana." "Yes, Sergeant." "And you think it'll work?" "I know it will." Coleman had exhaled slowly. "Walsh, if you miss a tripwire and one of our men gets killed, I'll personally shoot you myself. Understood?"
Yes, Sergeant. You've got Dawn. If you can clear lane faster than the engineers, do it. If you slow us down, I'm pulling you off point and you're carrying ammunition the rest of the war. Walsh had moved into position at 0500 hours. The fields south of the bridge were former farmland, overgrown, abandoned. Vegetation had grown wild since the war started. Grass, weeds, small bushes, perfect terrain for concealing tripwires. Walsh uncoiled his rope, 40 feet of white clothesline, knots tied every 18 inches. He tied those knots himself at Camp Polk. Each knot was positioned to create maximum friction against wire while maintaining the rope's flexibility. The technique was simple. Hold one end of the rope, throw or drag the other end forward across the ground. Let the rope settle at shin height where tripwires would typically be strung. Walsh walked forward slowly, watching. The rope dragged across grass and dirt, moved freely, no resistance. He reached the rope's far end. Nothing. He coiled it, threw it forward again. Another 40 feet. Walked forward. Watched.
At 0523, the rope stopped moving. Walsh froze. The rope had gone taut. Something had caught it. He crouched low, studied the ground ahead. Dawn light was just beginning to filter through the clouds. Visibility was maybe 60 feet. Walsh moved forward carefully. 1 step. 2 steps. At 8 steps, he saw it. Tripwire. Thin steel wire strung between 2 wooden stakes, 6 inches off the ground. The rope had snagged on it. One of the knots had caught the wire and held. Walsh followed the tripwire to its attachment point. German stick grenade buried upright in the ground. Standard defensive booby trap. Anyone walking through this field who hit that wire would have triggered the grenade. Fragmentation would have killed or wounded everyone within 30 feet. Walsh marked it, moved forward, through the rope. By 0600 hours, Walsh had found 6 tripwires, 6 separate explosive devices, 6 booby traps that would have killed men from his company if they'd advanced through this field using standard tactics. Master Sergeant Coleman appeared at the hedgerow, watched Walsh work for 5 minutes without speaking, then called forward. "Walsh, how many?" "6 so far, Sergeant, all marked." "How fast are you moving?" "About 40 yards per 15 minutes, Sergeant." Coleman calculated. At that rate, Walsh could clear a 20-yard-wide lane, 200 yards deep, in about 90 minutes. Not fast, but faster than engineers with metal detectors, and more effective because the rope was catching tripwires the detectors couldn't find. "Keep moving, Walsh. I'm sending the engineers to your position to disarm what you're marking. The platoon advances behind you at 0700 hours." Walsh continued working. Throw rope, walk forward, watch for snags, mark what he found. The system was simple but effective. The rope caught on every tripwire it crossed. The knots amplified the friction. Walsh could see the rope's movement clearly, even in low light. By 0700 hours, Walsh had cleared 180 yards of lane, found 11 tripwires, 11 explosive devices, 11 booby traps that would have killed men from his company if they'd advanced through this field using standard tactics. The assault began at 0707. Walsh's platoon moved through the cleared lane in column formation. No casualties, no explosions. They advanced 200 yards, reached the German defensive positions, engaged with rifle fire. The Germans retreated. The field was secured by 0745.
Captain Hendricks appeared at Walsh's position after the fighting stopped, looked at Walsh, looked at the rope coiled in Walsh's hands, looked at the 11 white tape markers showing where tripwires had been disarmed. Hendricks didn't say anything for several seconds. Then he said, "Walsh, you just saved about 30 lives, maybe more." Walsh coiled his rope. "Just doing my job, sir." Hendricks shook his head. "No, you did something nobody thought would work. You cleared a tripwire field with a piece of clothesline and knots you tied yourself, and you didn't miss a single wire." "The technique's solid, sir." "The technique's solid," Hendricks repeated. He seemed to be processing this. "How long have you been carrying that rope?" "Since Camp Polk, sir." "And I told you to ditch it." "Yes, sir." Hendricks almost smiled. "Almost. You disobeyed a direct order." "Yes, sir." "Good. I'm assigning you to lead point for all mine and tripwire clearance operations until we reach Berlin." Word spread through the division faster than German artillery. Within 24 hours, every company commander knew about Walsh's rope drag technique. Some wanted demonstrations. Others wanted rope systems made for their own units. A few remained skeptical, thought Walsh had gotten lucky, thought rope couldn't reliably detect tripwires. Walsh didn't argue with them, just kept using his rope during operations, kept clearing fields and roads that standard procedures couldn't handle. On March 10th, Walsh cleared a road leading to a German supply depot, found 14 tripwires in 300 yards. The depot was captured without casualties. On March 13th, Walsh cleared fields around a village the Germans were using as a defensive position, found 19 tripwires connected to S-mines and grenades. The village was taken with minimal losses. On March 17th, Walsh was clearing a forest path when his rope caught on a tripwire connected to a 250-pound aerial bomb rigged as a booby trap. The bomb had enough explosive power to destroy everything within 100 yards. Engineers disarmed it. Walsh moved on to the next section of path. By late March, Walsh had cleared 27 separate areas, found 73 tripwires, 73 explosive devices that would have killed American soldiers if they'd been triggered. The division's engineering officer started making rope drag systems for other units. He used Walsh's design, exact specifications, 40-foot length, knots every 18 inches, white clothesline for visibility. The engineer produced 16 systems in 3 weeks. Not everyone could use them effectively. The rope drag required understanding how tripwires were deployed, required patience and attention to subtle changes in resistance, required the ability to read terrain and predict where Germans would place booby traps. Most soldiers found it too slow, preferred to rely on engineers and metal detectors. But about 9 men in the division mastered the technique. They became the unit's designated tripwire clearance specialists, not engineers. The Army didn't have formal tripwire clearance positions, but infantrymen who could advance through mine terrain faster than anyone else. Walsh trained those 9 men, showed them how to throw the rope, how to watch for snags, how to distinguish between catching on vegetation versus catching on wire, how to mark what they found without disturbing it.
By mid-April, those 9 specialists had cleared 41 separate areas, found 187 tripwires. German defensive positions that had been considered impassable were suddenly accessible. Attacks that would have required days of preparation by engineers were executed in hours with rope drag clearance. The rope drag system became unofficial standard procedure in Walsh's division. Men who'd mocked it at Camp Polk now requested it for their operations. Captain Hendricks included it in after-action reports, recommended it be evaluated for broader adoption across the Army. Nothing came of the recommendation. The Army's Ordnance Department reviewed the technique and determined it wasn't suitable for standardization. Too improvised, too dependent on individual skill, too lacking in technical sophistication. The official position was that engineers with metal detectors and prodding tools were adequate for mine and tripwire clearance. Specialized equipment and formal training were superior to field expedients developed by infantrymen with clothesline. Walsh received the official rejection in April 1945. He read it, folded it, put it in his pocket, kept the rope attached to his pack frame. The war continued. The 9th Armored pushed deeper into Germany, crossing the Ruhr, fighting through industrial towns, meeting Soviet forces at the Elbe River, watching the Third Reich collapse. Walsh's rope drag proved particularly effective in urban combat. German forces booby-trapped buildings and streets as they retreated. Tripwires connected to demolition charges, pressure plates under debris, anti-personnel mines hidden in rubble. Engineers struggled in urban terrain. Too much metal, too much interference. Metal detectors gave false readings constantly. Visual searches were slow and dangerous. Walsh's rope drag worked. Drag it across doorways before entry. Drag it down hallways. Drag it across streets before vehicles advanced. The rope caught on wires, marked the danger, saved lives. Walsh cleared 19 more areas in April. Urban buildings, factory compounds, railroad yards. Each location was trapped. Each location was cleared without casualties from tripwires. By May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, Walsh's confirmed clearances totaled 46 areas, 260 tripwires found and marked, 260 explosive devices that would have killed American soldiers if Walsh hadn't been dragging a piece of clothesline ahead of advancing infantry. Walsh was promoted to sergeant on May 10th, received a Bronze Star for his work at Remagen. The citation specifically mentioned his innovative field techniques that directly saved numerous American lives during combat operations. The rope that Walsh had carried since Camp Polk
was still attached to his pack frame. Frayed now, stained with mud and dirt from France, Belgium, and Germany, but intact, functional, proven. Walsh was discharged from the Army in November 1945. He returned to Pennsylvania with the rank of Staff Sergeant, 1 Bronze Star, Combat Infantryman Badge, and a 40-foot length of clothesline he was allowed to keep as personal equipment. The rope sat in a drawer in his parents' house for 2 years. Walsh rarely looked at it. The war was over. He'd moved on. He enrolled at Penn State University on the GI Bill, studied civil engineering, graduated in 1949, took a job with a construction company, married, had 4 children, built a life far from combat and far from anyone who'd ever called his rope drag system a housewife's hobby. Walsh never spoke publicly about the war. His children knew he'd served in Europe. They knew he'd been at Remagen. They didn't know about the rope drag, or the 260 tripwires, or the fact that their father had proven a technique the Army's Ordnance Department had rejected as impractical. In 1968, Walsh's oldest daughter found the rope in the garage, asked his father about it, about the faded white clothesline with knots tied every 18 inches. Walsh explained what it was, what it did. His daughter, who was studying physics at Cornell, understood immediately, called it elegant, and asked why the military hadn't adopted it.
Walsh shrugged. Because it wasn't invented in a laboratory. Because it looked homemade. Because people don't trust solutions that seem too simple. His daughter wanted to know if it had worked. Walsh said yes, it had worked. In 1985, a military historian researching combat engineering innovations contacted Walsh. The historian had found references to Walsh's rope drag technique in the 9th Armored Division's records. Wanted to interview him, document the method, understand how it had been used. Walsh agreed to the interview, explained the mechanics, showed the historian the rope still stored in his garage, the same rope from 1945. The historian wrote an article for a military engineering journal, described the rope drag as an example of battlefield innovation, noted that it had been rejected by the Army despite proven effectiveness in clearing over 260 tripwires during combat operations. The article generated some interest among military researchers and combat engineers, not widespread attention, just recognition from a small community of people who studied improvised solutions to tactical problems. Walsh received a few letters from veterans who'd served in the 9th Armored. Men who remembered the rope drag, remembered Walsh clearing fields at Remagen when everyone said it couldn't be done with clothesline. One letter came from Master Sergeant Coleman, retired and living in Florida. Coleman wrote, "Walsh, I called your rope drag system a housewife's hobby. I was wrong. You were right. Took me 40 years to admit that, but better late than never." Walsh wrote back, said Coleman didn't need to apologize, said everyone had done their best under terrible circumstances, said the war was history, and there was no point dwelling on it. Daniel Walsh died on June 14, 2003. He was 82 years old. The rope drag system he'd developed was never officially adopted by the U.S. military. But the rope itself was donated to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. It sits in a display case in the engineering exhibit, small placard explaining its history. Most visitors walk past without stopping. It looks like any other piece of old clothesline, except for the knots tied every 18 inches. That rope represents something important. Not just battlefield innovation, not just improvised engineering, something deeper. It represents the idea that good solutions don't require approval from technical committees or expensive research or advanced materials. Sometimes they require a coal miner's son from Pennsylvania,
who understands friction and refuses to accept that tripwires can only be found with metal detectors. The Army never mass-produced the rope drag system, never issued it as standard equipment, never incorporated it into training manuals. The official position remained that engineers with specialized equipment were the proper solution for mine and tripwire clearance. But in March 1945, outside Remagen, a piece of clothesline with knots tied every 18 inches proved that official positions don't always reflect reality. That sometimes the best solution is the simplest one. That sometimes the people who know best are the ones everyone dismisses as amateurs with improvised nonsense. Daniel Walsh proved that. 260 times across France, Belgium, and Germany, with a rope everyone said couldn't detect tripwires, with a technique everyone said was impractical. He proved it. Then he went home, lived a quiet life, never asked for recognition or vindication. The rope remains in that museum case, a reminder that war is won not just by generals and technology and logistics, but by individuals who see problems differently, who refuse to accept that something can't be done just because no one's done it before, who make their solutions from hardware store materials and common sense, and prove them where it matters most, in mined fields, under fire, with lives depending on the outcome.